I find it a little strange to be at a workshop on depictions of hell. When I was younger, I was once warned against idly leafing through a particular copy of the Bhagavad Purana. You just heard Ismail tell you about the biographies of people killed by the Quran. Well, you can add, in a way, metaphorically, my older brother to that list of people felled by sacred scripture. For he once leafed through the Bhagavad Puran, and having once done so, suffered since from dreams of being burnt alive in hell. That's the family story. Apparently this is the power not only of description, but also of illustration. Page after page of inventive tortures and glossy realistic modes, accompanying, to my mind, equally inventive descriptions in one of the most successful works of Indian theology. My father, blessed be his memory, purchased the book out of a pious intent to study. He kept the book for the illustrations. But neither he nor my brother could be said to have believed in hell, however much they may have dreamt of it after. They didn't believe in it in the sense of having taken up a propositional attitude. I apologize for the bits of philosophy that will creep in. They didn't take up a propositional attitude, I believe, I disbelieve, in propositions affirming the character of the existence of hell, but they were haunted by them. And that fact has haunted me. I'm not a professional student of art. In fact, I'm quite sure I am. If there is an opposite of that, I'm historically illiterate when it comes to art. I do not dream about hell, but I do think a very great deal about the imagination, whether conveyed in sentences or in line and color. And I'm tempted to say that what my brother's circumstances illustrate is the power of imagination. And so too do philosophical tours or art tours of hell and other realms. There are many kinds of hells, of course. There is the kind where a person advertises their own work, such as this. In a book-length project, I basically tried to explore the idea that philosophers in the late 4th and early 5th century, in a connected world stretching from the Mediterranean to the northwest of the subcontinent and into the Gangetic Valley, St. Augustine in North Africa, Vasubandhu in Peshawar, were exploring ideas of a connected psychogeography of possible existence, including hell. And what they were doing therein was not only exploring targets of belief, they were exploring the idea that to get a grip on what we are like, to get a grip on what our experience is like, in fact, to get a grip on the collective pronoun there, you have to explore alternative regions of experience, possibility, and being. Well, that's the book. I will not bore you with those details here. The idea is this: to treat the history of descriptions and illustrations and practices, circumambulation around monuments built to enact the idea of changing states of existence, meditative practices designed to induce in one first-personal experiences as of hell or heaven or other states, and to treat all of this as a chapter in the history not of actual states of affairs, well, what does actual mean, but as exercises and episodes in a history of human imagination. Now, to treat things this way is not modern. That's what I'm going to try and convince you of today. To treat hell and heaven as episodes in the history of imagination was already the way, and you've heard some of this from Ismail's presentation, how some non-modern, non-European scholars of religion have already put things. In class, in conversation with non-specialists, this can be met with skepticism. I frequently meet with the idea that it is pre-moderns who believe in things like hell, while skepticism is modern and European. But skepticism, or maintaining some distance from full-fledged commitment in belief, is neither located in time nor in space. In fact, I think the story is a bit arsi-versi, as Beckett might say. It is often moderns who believe in belief. And what I mean is this: it now comes naturally to us to think that words and statements and illustrations must always function as testimony, indicative reports of actual states of affairs, and that, to hammer the point home, the only attitudes we may take up with them is either assent or dissent. But that's not the case. More can be done by sentences purporting to represent states of affairs, and more can be entertained than simple belief or disbelief. And most importantly, belief is not simply available, it's always has to be made available through practices of imagination in pedagogic contexts or in worlds shaped to convey these possibilities as available to be believed in the first case. So that's all I'm going to try and convince you of today, how and why it might be good to think about hell and heaven as episodes in the history of imagination. And I make my case with the help of a text, a moment in a text developed by the Indian Buddhist philosopher Chandrakirti, who flourished in the 7th century CE. Chandrakirti is said by the Tibetan tradition that came after, and in which traditions his works continue to be studied as canon. He's said to have worked at Nalanda, a Buddhist university of particular repute. But of course, Tibetan scholars say this about anyone important to them. It's a bit like granting every single person who matters a posthumous degree from Harvard or Columbia. Wherever Chandrakirti worked, I don't know if he was Ivy League, he was canny, he was a good philosopher. In his work, in lucid words, Chandrakirti cites a scriptural work called Questions of Noble Pali, in which the Buddha finally comes clean. I have shown the peril of hell, and many thousands of beings were wretchedly upset, said the Buddha. Note the point. Hell has to be taught. It has to be brought into view. It has to be offered up as a target of possible belief. And the awareness of there being afterlives like this is not considered conventional or cultural. It's the work of epistemic heroes, journeymen of insight. In fact, even this depiction of the wheels of possible existence is said to have been made, commissioned on the basis of testimony of a journeyman hero named Mahamad Galyayana, who apparently it was his habit to visit hell and other realms time to time, day to day. Why, I do not know. But this apparently conveys the work of such heroes, of travelers who came back and told us what there was. But now the Buddha says, I did this, I showed it, but, however destabilizing, the Buddha went on to say, but in this world, and I quote, there is no being who, having died, goes to such a horrific, infelicitous circumstance, nor do the torturers who use swords and lances and daggers and conveyed in all this glorious detail in exhibitions such as this exist. It is imagination that has one see these there in such infelicitous circumstances, and it is imagination that causes us to see the daggers that plunge down into the body. End quote. The episodes are visceral, upsetting, but they're not real. Not if by that one means independent of our imagination or the constructive conceptual capacities of our minds. Neither place nor the phenomenal experience of pain are real, for each is informed by the conceptual capacities and the scripts for possible experience we have authored. We, a collective we. And so in teaching hell, the Buddha makes experiences like these possible. He makes the afterlife available, and it is considered analogous to our ability to dream. The point is made by Chandrakirti by quoting another scripture. For example, O exalted one, a promising graduate student says to the Buddha, trying to get extra credit. For example, O exalted one, a certain man asleep in a dream experiences himself as gone to hell. And there he would experience himself as cast into a boiling, glowing iron pot of many fathoms. Inside it he would feel harsh and sharp, acute, agonizing pain. In it he would experience mental anguish. He would be afraid. He would be terrified. He would fall into a state of dread. And then upon awakening, he would cry out and he would lament. And, well, to hell and back, even in an exhibition like this, is a journey of immersion and possible experience, analogous to falling asleep and dreaming. What lessons are there in this? There is an imaginative script that makes certain kinds of experience possible. Once internalized, there is a kind of forgetting of the imagination and the process by which such scripts are made and internalized. And such forgetting is what makes experiencing them as if real, as if independent environments, possible. Cultural institutions, Chandrakirti wants to say, afford us such collective nightmares and collective hopes, or as of heaven. And the history of such possibilities, institutions come to repress over time. All experience, Chandrakirti maintains, comes about the way that experience in hell does, through imagination, habituation, and forgetting. And so does our recovery from traumatic experience model a therapeutic response to people who claim to be in hell. Our recovery from culturally sanctioned hells and heavens involves a therapeutic process that's not unlike what one might say to one who wakes up from a dream as of being in hell. And let me pause here before I turn to give you the therapeutic moment and say, just as Ismail was saying about Sufi practices, there is a long history in Buddhist texts and in Buddhist practices of seeing a continuity of ordinary psychology, a kind of cosmogeography of possible states, and that such analogies like, say, moments of anger that enact in me a state of being a hell being, however momentarily, and all the global possibilities that represents, or being hungry or addicted and so being like a hungry ghost, or feelings of compassion or friendliness, and so enacting certain possibilities of pro-social boundless love, characteristics of certain gods and certain kinds of states. This can happen moment to moment. And the forgetting of these states can happen moment to moment, or they can happen in more meso-level states like hours during a day, or they can happen during lifetimes, as when, after tenure, I'm told, it feels more and more like a god. So what's the therapeutic response? Upon awakening, the one who dreamt of hell might cry out and lament and wail, "Oh, the pain! Oh, the pain! I've been in grad school." His friends and acquaintances and relatives would then that's not in Scripture. Like, I know this is getting recorded, and I sometimes worry about the ad-libbing, but that's me, right? His friends and acquaintances and relatives will say, What pain? What are you talking about?" He would speak to those friends and acquaintances thus, "I have experienced the pain." And he would then scold them, rebuke them, saying, "Really, I experienced all this bloody pain, all this hellish pain, and you go on to ask me, what pain is this of yours?" And then those friends would speak to the man as follows, well, if they're good friends, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. You were asleep. You never left the house to go someplace else." And then his memory would surface. "I was asleep. That which I assumed to be happening is false. It is unreal." And once again he recovers his contentedness. This kind of mental equilibrium, being at ease, requires memory, again reversing the process of collective forgetting of our collective imaginative history. So that's the secret of all therapy, apparently. Well, what do we take away from this? Perhaps historians of philosophy and religion should also practice a kind of recovery, as this exhibition does too. What does that mean? It's a way of resisting, perhaps, cultural forgetting by inquiring into the history of our imagination, our practices, and our possibilities, and allow it to move us beyond questions of simple belief and disbelief, and allow us to experiment with possibilities and experience that can still be ours. The Buddha taught hell. It was upsetting, like a therapeutic form of anti-therapy or shock therapy. But in his comments, Chandrakirti wants to say that while you could argue that it has a moral purpose for generating fear in moral failing or moral hope, given the promise of reward for good behavior, an error comes from trying to seek to ground such hopes or fears in ontology, to seek to render it intelligible as part of the furniture of our world without reference to culture and our practices. The danger comes from naturalizing hell. Once introduced, once made a target of belief, it ceases to function as it should. I think Chandrakirti is right, and I think Ismail, as Ismail's talk showed us so beautifully, there are such uses for hell in moral education, but I think he's wrong to think that non-propositional uses of hell are restricted to moral education. There is so very much people have done with hell and heaven and alternative experiential realms. Let me conclude with this. Chandrakirti's own use of hell suggests a more sophisticated way to consider our immersion in these possibilities of experience. The creation, hell and heaven and all of it, involves the creation of realms of possible experience and of virtual reality on a collective, historically sanctioned scale. Earlier, Chandrakirti cites a work that has a dialogue illustrating a mnemonic phrase which the Buddha offers in this work as encapsulating his entire teaching. All of the Buddhism comes down to this, at least in this work. All phenomena, Manjushri, are Narakamukha. I apologize for going to Sanskrit for a bit. If you squint really quickly at that compound, or you listen to it very quickly, it sounds like the Buddha just said, all phenomena are the cause of hell. That's experience is hellish. But what he actually says is, it invites us to look closer or listen more carefully. All phenomena, the Buddha said in this text, all experiential factors have as their source something that is analogous to the source of hell. But again, if you squint or you listen to it too closely, it sounds like he's saying all phenomena are hell, even this lecture. But luckily, Buddhists, let's be honest, but luckily all things come to an end, hell included, even if it does hold the clue to all human experience. It's worth thinking about. Thank you for your attention.
Wow, who would have thought that hell could be funny? So thank you, Sonam, for that. And thank you to Ismail for introducing us to hellfire. So we're going to move from hellfire and from imagining hell and from forgetting hell to someone who stood at the gateway to hell. So I'm going to actually talk about Yama, the god of death. And before I do so, thank you all for being here so early in the morning for discussions about hell. I think you'll gain good karma in doing so. And thank you so much to Asia Society for bringing us all together. Thank you to Laura Weinstein for organizing this fabulous symposium. Okay, let's start with Yama, who you see here pictured in all his glory. The circa 12th century stone Yama sculpture on view in the exhibition has proven to be a fruitful point of departure and spurred me to think of various transformations of Yama himself and the individuals who engage with him. First, Yama, who is the god of death, undergoes several changes in status and conception from the Vedic period into the present. Second, the traditions introduce us to at least 3 individuals who encounter Yama and who, either because of their own wisdom and tenacity or due to their intense devotion to another deity, manage to defeat death. I'll examine both textual and visual evidence from the Indian subcontinent to consider these interactions with Yama and their spiritual residue. But let's first talk about Yama. According to the Rig Veda, which is dated to around 1500 BCE, Yama was the first mortal to die and find the path to the afterworld. Importantly, Yama became the ruler of the realm of the dead, which was thought to be below the earth. And yesterday we talked about these spatial imaginations of hell. And so clearly here we're seeing that heaven and hell dichotomy with hell below the earth. And the Rig Veda urges the dead to follow Yama's path to that realm. It's worth pointing out that Vedic conceptions of hell are vague. Hell is simply a subterranean space deep within the realm of the dead, and the wicked are entrapped there. But by the epic period, so by the early centuries BCE, Yama is transformed from the ruler of the world of deceased ancestors to the god of death. Scholars suggest that this transformation goes hand in hand with shifts in practices for disposing the dead, with the standard rite moving from burial to cremation. From this point on, Yama judged the dead, and he did so with rigorous fairness and began to be known as the king of dharma, that is, the king of religious law. He was an authority on dharma, a teacher, and I'll say more about this role in a bit. It's also in the epic text that the figure of Yama begins to take shape. The great Sanskrit epic, the Mahabharata, describes Yama as a handsome man, resplendent like the sun, smoothly black and red-eyed. He's said to be terrifying, however, wearing yellow robes and a turban and carrying a noose in his hand. So I love the specificity that we get here in the Mahabharata and this attention to color. That noose, of course, that Yama carries was meant to fetter the soul, to bind the soul and carry it to the netherworld, which was located in the southern direction. We encounter Yama in the story of the devoted wife, Savitri, whose husband's soul Yama comes to collect and will return to her shortly. Heavens and hells also become differentiated Indeed, epic thought conceived of 7 hells and 7 heavens, and it was Yama's judgment, crucially, that determined an individual's place in those realms. The other Sanskrit epic, the Ramayana, also describes Yama, and that too in a dream sequence. Here, Yama appears to Prince Bharata as an omen of his father's death. Bharata's dream is elaborate, beginning with visions of his father bobbing in a pool of dung and drinking sesame oil, followed by natural calamities such as the oceans drying and the moon falling from the sky. Then, after a few more visions, he sees, quote, a righteous man wearing red garlands and smeared with red cream, hurrying off toward the south on a chariot yoked with asses, unquote. Bharata specifically connects the chariot drawn by asses and southward movement with an impending funeral pyre for one of his family members, including himself. Certainly the red color features in both accounts, as does southward movement. And you notice in this image that we're looking at, which is very late, that red is a prominent color, and it's used to kind of bring Yama to form or to life. Both texts also highlight the figure's beauty and or righteousness. While the Ramayana does not come out and say it, the righteous man described in Bharata's dream can be none other than Yama, the so-called guardian of the southern direction. So again, the importance of space and location to these formulations of hell and Yama. Which brings me to the post-epic period, by which time the idea that Yama was a guardian of the south becomes fixed. Now we're well into the first millennium CE, and Yama is integrated into temple sculpture along with other directional guardians. As you can see in these images, sculpted images of Yama appear on the southern elevation of temple walls. The phenomenon is pan-Indian, even though I'm showing you a temple from southeastern India. Sometimes we also see such sculpture, so sculpted images of Yama, on ceiling panels. These guardians of the directions are known as Dikpalas or Lokapalas, and most are Vedic gods who've been subsumed in the pantheon of the 3 major Hindu gods, Shiva, Vishnu, and Devi. Wendy Doniger, the well-known religious scholar, calls this a progressive decline of the Vedic gods. Well, we can leave that discussion for a different day. Texts known as the Puranas give us information about the prescribed iconography for these deities. They also describe the omens of death, the path to Yama, the torments of hell, which we've been hearing about, the kinds of sins that lead to hell, and the rituals, importantly, that should be performed for the dead so that they can escape some of these torments. By now, hells are highly differentiated. Yama has 8,400,000 hells at his disposal. So this number is staggering, but maybe it says something about the kinds of transgressions that people commit. In the context of the ever-shifting morphology of Yama, it's also significant that he appears differently to individuals depending on their own spiritual progress. So as a benevolent Yama to the good, and as a terrifying figure to the less than good. He also seems to adopt iconographic elements of the more powerful god with whom he's associated, whether Shiva or Vishnu. But let's go back to his specific iconography. The Matsya Purana tells us that, quote, the image of Yama should be made holding a staff and a noose, riding on a huge buffalo, black like soot, or seated on a throne with eyes sparkling like fire. Round his image should be made images of Chitragupta, some formidable attendants, groups of quiet and formidable demons, and the great buffalo. So by this time, it seems that the buffalo had become associated with Yama, even though it's not mentioned in earlier invocations. And here I'm juxtaposing our exhibition image, which I already showed you, and that image is from Cambodia. It's from 12th century Cambodia. And of course, it shows Yama seated on a buffalo. And we have numerous images from South Asia, from different cultural contexts, in sculpture and painting. To be sure, visual and textual representations do not always align, and it's useful and it's important to think of the two as belonging to related, parallel, and even independent traditions. So let me now turn to 3 encounters with Yama and to the transformations these engendered. The first is perhaps the most renowned, even though it's not the first chronologically. It comes from the Mahabharata, the Sanskrit epic I mentioned previously. The story appears in Book 3 of the epic, and it tells of Savitri, the paradigm of wifely devotion in the Hindu tradition. The Ramayana, too, alludes to the story, as do the later Puranas. The tale features Savitri, whose husband, Satyavat, is destined to die a year after their marriage. On the appointed day, Savitri and Satyavat set out for the forest to gather firewood. Because of his exertions, Satyavat feels faint and lays his head down on Savitri's lap. Yama appears soon after to collect Satyavat's soul. The text describes this episode evocatively, and I quote, "Thereupon, Yama forcibly drew from Satyavat's body a thumb-sized person who was fettered with the noose," there's the noose again, "and was in his power. The body gave up its spirit, its breathing stopped, its sheen faded, and it became motionless and not pleasing to watch. Having tied him, Yama set out to the south. Savitri followed sorrowfully," unquote. The southern direction again. The devoted Savitri not only follows Yama, but moves him with her wise and beautiful discourse on dharma, religious law, ethics. Impressed by her, Yama grants her a boon and entreats her to turn back. She asks for eyesight for her father-in-law, which the god grants. But she continues to follow him, speaking still. Impressed again, the god grants her another wish, again asking her to turn back. This time she asks for her father-in-law's kingdom to be restored to him. This too the god gives, but she persists and continues to speak about right principles and those who follow dharma. Again the god grants her a boon, and this time she asks for sons for her own father. No doubt, Yama grants this wish as well. But she's undeterred and keeps on speaking and keeps on following. Yama grants her a 4th wish, and this time she asks for 100 sons for herself and her husband. Yes, exactly. Smart. Yama grants this too, and is therefore forced to grant her last wish, and you guessed it, that Satyavat be restored to life. As I hope it's clear, Savitri manages to outsmart Yama, the expert on dharma, and ensure longevity and eternal life for herself and her husband through progeny. The next story is also pan-South Asian and told in many Puranas, though I'll be concerned here with local forms in Tamil and Telugu-speaking lands. At its center is the Brahmin youth Markandeya, who was fated to die at the age of 16. So you're seeing a pattern here. Again, at the appointed hour, Yama arrives, but Markandeya, who's a devotee of the great god Shiva, embraces the linga, the aniconic symbol of the god and the central icon of worship in Shiva temples. I love this image because of the dynamism with which it portrays Yama. I mean, look at him, like just leaping from his buffalo and with his noose. According to legends in Tamil lands, the god of the temple at Tirukkadavur emerges from the linga to free the lad from Yama's snare. Shiva gives Yama one mighty kick and kills him, thus ending death itself. This story is one of 8 stories that celebrate the heroic deeds of the god Shiva and localize them in places across the Tamil landscape. The other stories also involve the god conquering either another deity or a demon. In the former case, he conquers the gods Brahma and Kama, while in the latter scenario, he destroys the elephant demon Gajasura and the demon's triple city. The Markandeya story and the temple in which it takes place were sung as early as the 6th to the 8th centuries by the Shaiva saints, the saints who were devoted to the god Shiva, and appear in a collection of devotional songs called the Tevaram. The myths may be of great antiquity, but they continue to be sung and celebrated into the present day, and they were certainly well known in the 19th century when this image was made. What I'm showing is a painting from an album made in the first part of the 19th century in southern India. Such albums contain as many as 100 paintings and include themes related to Shiva and Vishnu, as well as images of renowned temples. They were made by Indian artists, collected by Europeans, and often included inscriptions in Indian and European languages. Albums like this one were commissioned across India by officers of the East India Company and go by the moniker company painting. That this particular myth was significant is suggested by its place in such albums. Albums often contain both a single image of Yama as well as the encounter involving Yama, Shiva, and Markandeya. This next image is from an album of 100 paintings, and it's the 5th image in the sequence, while the solo image of Yama is the 11th. The album is fascinating, too, for its juxtaposition of Telugu and English inscriptions. I've been intrigued by the divergences between the Telugu and the English. For instance, the Telugu inscription of Yama, the solo image, tells us the buffalo is Yama's mount, whereas the English one tells us that Yama takes the souls of the world. The Telugu of this Markandeya image is far more literary than the English, which is rudimentary, only giving the basic information about Shiva killing Yama to protect his disciple. The English also transliterates the names of figures using Telugu forms, not Sanskritic ones. Thus, Yama is rendered as Yamudu, the Telugu word for the god, rather than Yama, the Sanskrit. Some albums also contain multiple layers of commentary that are outside the scope of this talk, but which should provide valuable information about collecting and viewing practices in colonial India. So let me conclude by telling you a last story. If Markandeya conquers death because of Shiva's intervention, and Savitri through her own ingenuity, the youth Nachiketas is possibly more interesting for the radical transformation he undergoes because of his dialogue with Yama, the teacher of Dharma. Nachiketas is first and foremost interested in the ontology of death and is tenacious in getting answers from Yama. He ends up in Yama's world because of a curse of his father's, and once there, asks, "O death, tell us what there is in that great hereafter." Wouldn't we all like to know that? He says it perhaps even more precisely here. There is that doubt when a man is dead, some saying he is, others he is not. This I should like to know, taught by thee. In other words, how are we to think of the dead? Are they or are they not? Do they exist or do they not? Not surprisingly, Yama tries to put off Nachiketas, as he does Savitri, and replies, "On this point, even the gods have doubted. It's not easy to understand. That subject is subtle. Choose another boon, O Nachiketas. Do not press me, and let me off that boon." The backstory is as follows. Upon first arriving at Yama's abode, Nachiketas is offered no hospitality. Yama does not receive him, and the boy does not eat or drink for 3 days, and it's for this reason that Yama grants him 3 boons. After receiving the first 2 boons, Nachiketas' last wish is to gain understanding of death, which Yama is reluctant to share. But thanks to his unshakable persistence, which we should recognize from the other stories, Yama gives in. However, unlike Savitri and Markandeya, what Nachiketas gains is far more valuable. While they gain longevity in this life, a full lifespan, Nachiketas gains immortality. The Upanishads, which are the texts which first articulate this story, tell us that we're all caught in the wheel of re-death, fated to experience death in lifetime after lifetime. Re-death, in my view, is a more apt way of thinking about the transmigration of the soul, the idea that's central to Brahmanical, Buddhist, and Jaina thought. As Wendy Doniger says about the authors of these early texts, what they feared most of all was what they called recurrent death, a series of re-deaths and the rebirths that are preludes to them. Surely, if experiencing death once is terrible enough, the idea that one must experience it repeatedly is no doubt unbearable, untenable. Yet, thanks to Yama's teaching and his illuminating exposition on the nature of the self and its relationship to the all-pervading, bright Brahman, the immortal self, Nachiketas became free of old age and death. And this is according to the Katha Upanishad. And the Upanishad adds meaningfully, and so will anyone who knows this teaching. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much to the three panelists for just an extraordinary beginning to the day. Three superb papers that really illuminate very different but interconnected aspects of the traditions that we'll all be thinking about, and each one of which resonates in very interesting ways with last night's keynote address by Francisca Cho. So there's so much to discuss here. It's difficult for me to not think about these materials in reference to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition that I'm mostly familiar with, which has its own long history of reflection on hells and stories. In particular, a very important tradition that Tibetans call the Delok, which means gone and returned, people who have died and gone to hell and report back on their experiences. These are typically women, and they are their stories of their experiences in hell became important materials for painted and narrated traditions of accounts of hell that were really widespread throughout the Himalayas. Very interesting tradition, and I see resonances in these stories of the fearlessness of Sufis filled with the fire of their love for God, and the fearlessness in confronting hellfire, and these figures that we've learned about from the Indian tradition confronting Yama and outsmarting him in various ways. And even in Chandrakirti's own really reflections as well on how to understand hell in relation to experience more broadly, and that there is, I think, a fearlessness there as well. So I have just a few questions that I might pose to the entire panel, and in the hope that we can discuss across these different traditions some things that are in common. So in one sense, the title of this panel, Hell and the Desire for Spiritual Transformation, points us to this notion of transformation. So what is in fact transformative here? And I started to think as I was listening to the papers that in some way each of these examples from quite different cultural and religious contexts kept bringing my mind to the capacity for experience itself, an experience of something other than our own day-to-day experience, right? So in Professor Kachru's talk, for example, he told the story, this is a canonical Buddhist story of great importance throughout the Buddhist world, of the Buddha's own close disciple, Mahamudgalyayana, who in China, of course, comes to be known as Mulian. And as Professor Kachru said, he seemed to travel to other worlds from time to time, and who knows why, right? I think that's an interesting question to begin with. Why, right? So on one sense, of the two main disciples, Shariputra and Modgalyayana, it's often said that Shariputra was considered the greatest expert in meditative insight and clarity and wisdom, whereas Modgalyayana was proficient in miraculous powers and the ability to travel to different worlds. So what is gained from this ability to travel to different worlds, to experience these different worlds, and how does that lead to spiritual transformation in some sense? And in one way, we might ask, is there something specific in this example about the experience of hell, or does that just provide a particularly powerful venue for experiencing experience itself, right? Is it the intensity of the torment and suffering that he encounters there which provokes an unavoidable recognition of the fact that you are experiencing a world, right? So what I mean by this is we tend to go through our lives, if you're anything like me, somewhat on autopilot, not really recognizing the fact that we're experiencing things. And in fact, in my own life, mostly very painful moments or moments of great fear, that will kind of jolt me into a sense of I'm experiencing something now, right? So could it be that there's a way in which that hell is just a particularly helpful reminder of the fact that there is an experiencer experiencing something, and that this might be somewhat at play in all of these different traditions. So I just pose that as one question we might start with in terms of thinking about those things. Maybe, Sonam, since I would directly respond to you, if you could.
I'm fairly blown away by these comments, Ben. First, thank you. It's always lovely to have someone listen this attentively and to be able to understand what one has said better than one could oneself. But then to add to it a question that I think is really, really illuminating for all of us. I'm going to take a first stab at it. I think it's beautifully put that we are dealing with a question about what it means to experience in the following two senses. One, that our experiences are not static. Like, if I may now speak allegorically from taking what our traditions have been talking about, we move from circumstance to circumstance all the time. We're constantly finding ourselves in transitional moments, right? Moving from an experiential circumstance to another. So that's the first order kind of transformation. And then there's the second order question of how do you understand these movements? How do you understand waking up one day and being different than one thought one was, waking up one day and experiencing more intently than one was? And then there's the question of how do you model that, right? So in both these kinds of motions, the first order and the second order, I think, are at stake here. How do I make sense? Are we or are we not? People say, like, am I still the same person? Am I not? You know, like, all change requires us thinking about this. But hell, in at least the people I read, I think it's a beautiful point that hell is experience made evident by just turning up the knobs, right? First off, it alerts us to experience as a dimension, just the sheer phenomenal intensity that it implies, right? That we kind of are thrown out of certain kinds of habitual loops. The other thing that at least the philosophers I read say that makes hell interesting is it is constitutive of experience that is hellish, that it's not just all the knobs are turned up to 11, as it were. It's the experience of someone doing it to you, right? It's this, so in the canonical phrases that hell consists of these torturers, these beings whose entire raison d'etre is to torture one. And then the question is, oh my goodness, what if most of our experience is actually authored in ways in which we cede the authority and the intelligibility and the cause of our experience to these other factors? Like right now, I'm sitting here and part of what I'm experiencing is this feeling of being in an external environment over which I have no control, right? Now, what if that's part of what makes our experience what it is this kind of sense of these moments when we come alive to our own experiential qualities, and yet we outsource the reasons and causes for that. to these other factors, and that partly understanding our experiences, like coming back to realize just as hell maybe does not have these other kinds of these, right? Maybe, as Sartre said, experience too is a hell where all the suffering is self-service, right? That we are authors of our own experiences. I think it's a beautiful comment to start with.
In both of your papers, we encounter figures who turn the tables on this situation, right? Where they're no longer just passive recipients of torture, they are encountering and engaging with and transforming those environments. So how do we understand, in some sense, the way these figures may be seen as, are they models for our behavior in some way? Is there something in that sense of these figures?
Well, I just want to echo what just been said about, thank you for the profound question, Ben. I think, I'm very interested with the way in which you phrase it, that, perhaps, the way hell is important as a way of intensifying, one's understanding of experience as experience, that is how to experience. And of course, which means that the intensity of what one's envisioned then helps us to really be more attuned to our own experience in the daily life, and not take it for not to take the everyday for granted. But then. Yes, I agree with what Sonam just said. There is this sense of powerlessness, of being in hell, experiencing powerlessness, experiencing oneself, in the hands of the torturers and not being able to do anything about it. And yet you have, as I said in my presentation, you have Sufi scholars and visionaries who basically somewhat tries to reassert, their own agency or their own, desire for God in a way that can trump that powerlessness. But of course, forgetting about hell requires that you first understand hell, right? It requires that you imagine that hell actively, and you cannot simply, because it's not being indifferent to hell. It's taking hell seriously, and then bypassing that, to see towards something in the beyond. I think that's key to the way in which they think. But also, I think it's very important to stress that for Sufis have a very clear notion of epistemic hierarchies, right? That is that knowledge is not for different knowledge is for different kind of people. In that they would stress the need for envisioning hell and the torture of hell for the commoners, but not for the elites and the which, by the way, when they talk about commoners or elites, they are talking about this in terms of epistemic capacity, right? The intellectual capacity to know the truth, not in the sense of class or caste, etc. So I guess for the elites and for those who with more developed sense of imagination, then hell can become a distraction for them, because you are able to actually abstract, for example, some of the lessons from the more corporeal imaginary of hell towards, say, for example, this is actually a chronotopic representation of God's coercive power and God's, so that helps you to be in awe, for example, of something that is mighty.
Yeah. And as your presentation showed so clearly and skillfully, there are so many different modes with which Sufi authors depicted hell and represented hell throughout time. I was really moved by the description of, in the early tradition, these images of figures whose experience of hell had such a capacity to experience hell vividly that the bellows would cause them to faint, or seeing fires in the marketplace. So it's a sense in which this imagination of the experience of another world becomes so embodied that they respond to sensory phenomena in our everyday life as a reminder of that experience so powerfully. And so that's part of what made me think of a connection with this capacity for experience being accentuated.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening so carefully and for these provocative questions. I think it would be useful to bring in the visual material to answer or to address. Okay, sorry. It would be useful to bring in the visual material to address the question of imagination and of imagining hell. Because why is it that we have this abundance of visual material in depicting and in describing the tortures of hell, the various figures who perform these tortures, the different kinds of punishments that are meted out for different kinds of sins and so on. And as Francisca pointed out yesterday, the imagination of heaven is far more measured, is far more limited than the imagination that produces hell. And so again, what does hell do in terms of kind of pushing us out of the quotidian that you raised? And what is that encounter with hell? What does that do, not just for the imagination, but also for kind of this reckoning with the quotidian that happens? And I think the story of King Anala that was introduced yesterday is important as well, because here it's merely illusory, but still it's providing incredible fodder for the imagination, and again allows you to leap out of the quotidian and confront this rich imagination of hell, and then whatever that leads to, whether that leads to a kind of redemption, whether that leads to transformation in one's daily life, but it is, and I was thinking, it seems to me that when you confront visions of hell, it's a way of being both in the current moment and in the quotidian, but also engaging with something else. So in a sense, like there's multiple temporalities, but there's also like there's a meta vision that's happening, as well as what we're surrounded by, like the furniture, to use, I think it was Sonam who talked about furniture, like the everyday furnishings versus what's happening in this kind of rich imaginary world.
I love that comment. I love Ismail saying that there's a difference between an indifference to hell and afterlives and a forgetting of it. I think these are crucial. With hell, one thing, along with the variety and intensity, there is something phenomenologically really striking about pain. Like if you just think about what pain does to experience, it sort of constricts the room one has to adopt perspectives, right, or to see oneself. There are certain things that pain does not allow for. And conversely, meditating on pain and the experiences of those who are adopting pain, there's something very powerful and imaginatively one does, right? Returning epistemic room to things that it is shrunk, and then internalizing that as relevant to our situation now. Anyway, we're just creating these kinds of imaginative room that is lovely.
Can I just jump in? I think that's very interesting, because certainly somebody like a Sufi theologian, philosopher like Ghazali would say that. He would explain that hell is being described as fire precisely because fire is probably the most painful form of experience that we have, but we cannot really imagine that hell is going to be all fire. It's just an intense imagination of pain, right? And the productive value of pain, I think.
Yes, that's really interesting.
And that actually, sorry, I'll just finish. And that actually brings a very interesting question, particularly in the way in which one of the hallmark of modernity has been this attempt to repress pain and seeing pain as there's nothing valuable about pain. There's nothing good about pain. Pain is something that we need to repress. If we have pain, we drink painkillers. That education should not be painful. Everything should, etc. And I mean, of course, we all experience that. So, I mean, how is that? The fact that we are so discomforted today in our modern sense and sensibilities with the question of hell has also to do with the way in which our understanding of pain has changed in the past 200, 300 years.
I think the relationship between pain and forgetting is important that you raised, but then I also think this idea that hell, or the imagination of hell, or the fear of hell, the evocation
It's
of
the mic,
hell.
it's not the...
I think it's maybe the position of the mic.
The mic is going in and out.
Okay, I'll do my best. So the relationship between hell and forgetting, pain and forgetting, but also the idea that the concretization of hell is for some individuals and not for others, I think is an important idea to explore, because it makes me think of image worship in the South Asian context, and how in the early debates about whether we should allow image worship or whether it was worthy or not. Again, these kinds of distinctions were made that for those who those like these Sufis. Who are of a more advanced spiritual bent, do not need to imagine gods in a concrete or tangible form, but image worship was something that was necessary for other orders of society. So again, it seems like we're seeing the same kind of trend with vis-a-vis heavens and hells as well.
Right. Absolutely.
There's also the thing, like this comment brings up the point you showed up, the Dante before Dante and Ibn Arabi, right? Like this idea, like that, what you're seeing replicated too in these spaces are social spaces, but parts of them were reformulated, or which bodies are getting to do the suffering in hell, and which ones are getting to do the imagination of those sufferings is also heavily coded, right? That's a nice. These are nice points.
Right.
That really brings up the question of the role of these visual images, in this entire tradition, right? And this exhibition is an extraordinary collection of different visual representations, and each of the papers talked about traditions trying to cultivate an ability to imagine hell in some way, right? And to envision these realms. And this is a very material representation of that there is a value in those. I also, was thinking about artworks that, to me, sort of engendered an experience of those things, and the closest thing I could think of was the musician and performance artist Diamanda Gallas, who, in her performances, tried to sort of channel the pain of the HIV/AIDS epidemic and kind of musical performances that were deeply disturbing in a very embodied level to listen to those things, and trying to imagine, did viewers of these images at times, could they feel those things, right? There are other times when it seems that the artists just are enjoying the freedom of expression that the topic affords them, to include humor and perhaps put some of their own personal enemies in the paintings in different ways, and that there are traditions that are much more light and not really about engendering this intense experience of pain and suffering. So we see a range of different artistic responses, but the principle of making visible hell, making it visible in some sense, functions in different but also similar ways across these traditions, it seems to me.
So is another way of saying what you're saying, that visions of hell and those who populate hells are culturally specific and temporally specific, like what form we give to Yama, or what form we give to demons, or what form we give to the people who populate, or the creatures, I should say, who populate hells, is culturally specific.
Yes.
What do they look like? What is their skin color? What do they have animalistic features? What are their features? What are their physical features?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as Professor Cho demonstrated in the lecture last night, there are cultural differences, and there also seem to be some structural similarities across these that are also quite interesting to think about, right? And what does that suggest about perhaps human understandings of worlds of suffering and the way that those are envisioned, right? That there are certain similarities that we see across some of these traditions. I bitterly regret not making the keynote last night, which I will have to hurt myself in some envisioning of a form of hellish torment for many days to come. And I wonder, this point has surely been made by now, and many people are familiar with it, but there's a sense in which the word
we should not let the word vision attach only to certain modalities of the arts and not others, or not, like, I've been thinking about the incongruity of an audience that wants to visit this beautiful exhibition and tour these paintings, having to listen to academics, right? Except for you, who know what you're doing, and I apologize on behalf of both of us. But then it occurred to me that there's something wrong about that thought, because there is long been in many cultures a very profound connection between imagination as a process of making explicit or bringing into being and making evident or experientially real across modalities, right? So I mentioned the philosopher Chandrakirti stressing that there is a link between passage into the afterlife and falling asleep, in that in both these are conditions in which one has experiences as of certain kinds of things that turn out not to be sustained upon waking up. But reading a book is just like that. Watching a painting is an immersion like that. So there are these and then meditations you're said to be where the mind is as a painter, or you practice as a painter would painting scenes, right? There's kind of these profound continuities across various practices in which we make explicit, make clear, help remember, help forget. I don't know how to put that together with this range you're saying of affordances for different like different moods, different reasons, different purposes, different locations, as you were saying,
and different senses, right? Different sensorium. You know,
exactly.
For example, in the Semitic tradition, the oral is perhaps has much more force.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the thing. The word when
imagination
is it
than visual
exactly.
culture, right?
Exactly.
But also the senses need to be trained. I mean, it's not simply just seeing for the sake of seeing. It's a particular way of seeing. It's a particular way of listening. That and this goes back to your point that the practical aspect of believing, of imagining, that you need to train in order to bring about this particular kind of attunement, right? That allows you to spark that imagination.
I would add that there is thought about even sense hierarchies and what each...
that's right. That's right.
If you're looking at historical sources, and also this understanding that depending on the medium that you were consulting, so whether you're looking at text or whether you're looking at image or you're listening to music or watching a dance performance, there's also an understanding, I think, in various cultures that each medium had its powers, but also that there were ways in which a medium was more crippled or was silent. So there are certain things that, let's say, text cannot do that image can do, and vice versa. So I think that it's important to articulate that as well as, or to be aware of that.
I think that's right, and maybe different possibilities for, like, say, the humor can go with one medium in certain contexts, and other media have other kinds of affordances, like today film, or Professor Cho's written a lot about like how a lot of the texts that seem to us two-dimensional or static are actually offering us modes of representational experiential possibilities that today we would realize in different forms.
And how those are received changes so much. And I think the comments that you made about the modern grasping for an ontological understanding, it becomes an obstacle to the way these are understood. I'm reminded of a friend who was a Tibetan Buddhist monk who lived at a monastery in Kathmandu, and he was trying to start a Buddhist meditation center where they would do teachings for tourists visiting from Europe and the Americas. And he said to me, I don't know what's wrong. I have, the first day we have 50 people coming, and by the third day, it's only, a couple people left. They're just not interested. I said, well, what are you teaching? He said, beginning with the hells, of course. And in the traditional overview of the Buddhist path, you begin with laying out the sufferings of the 6 realms, and he was spending 3 days describing the hells. And I said to him, that's not what they're here for. They're not interested in that at all. He said, but it's the most entertaining part, and so, that's why we begin with this, and so I think there's
and that's for Netflix now, I think.
Right. A very different framework of what's happening when we're describing these hell realms, and how is it functioning, and or are we only seeing it as a sort of tool for using fear to create a kind of moral discipline, or are there other acts of imagination involved?
Ben, you just raised a beautiful point, and this came out in your presentation so beautifully. The twinning of these realms of possible experience and narrative structures, right? The very idea of like a tour, or the sense of following a journey, or I mean, this goes to some of the earliest models we have for articulating a sense of passage, or I don't think it's merely entertainment, because I think there's nothing merely about entertainment. But right, the sense, right. This is like Nachiketa's going to Yama. I mean, it's so beautiful. It's such a beautiful moment. Like what starts it all is he doesn't get the hospitality due to him, right?
Yeah.
And then these little things. These are come on.
They're amazing. And
they're amazing.
These lithographs. What an extraordinary visual representation of these stories. Yes. I've never seen anything quite like that. Could you just say a little bit about that mode of representation of these stories? I mean,
I can say more about those albums in which these paintings were collected, and I'm still at the start of the exploration.
Leaping out of it, it's extraordinary.
And also the fact that they're represented in album after album. Yeah. That story clearly had great saliency in southern India, in Tamil-speaking lands and in Telugu-speaking lands. And also, what's interesting is that it is part of a broader cycle of feats performed by the god Shiva. I think that it's you raised the question of ingenuity as well, and I think it's important. It might be useful to talk about these figures who kind of confront hells, or who confront figures who are at the gateway of hells, and who manage to outsmart them and outwit them. And what does that say about
our earliest immigration stories?
Right. So there are these expediencies, right? You can give a cow to the Brahmin, or you can give gifts to Brahmins. You can do all of these things in this world to ensure a better afterlife for your ancestors. But then certain ancestors seem to outwit Yama himself on their own, through their own action. So what do we do with those kinds of figures? And then and then what is happening to a figure like Yama when he's in a sense superseded by another figure? And so there's a transformation that's occurring in this kind of pantheon itself, as well as in the individual who encounters this pantheon.
I've neglected to keep track of time, but are we going to open up to? Yeah, if there are questions from the audience for any of these.
It could be more basic.
Hi, I guess we should probably, I think you all know who I am. I'm Adriana, I'm the curator of the show.
That seems to be an issue.
Yeah. I am so, that was such a wonderful panel, and thank you for realizing what my dream was for this symposium. Thanks to Laura, too, for choosing you all and bringing you here. One thing that I'm kind of struck by and thinking about sort of intentionally including a range of different kinds of objects and images in this exhibition.
Into the mic, please.
And I wonder if, this is just sort of a suggestion, and I'm also curious about what you think about shifting perspective a little bit and thinking about these images and in some ways also the text, and thinking about audience. Who was the intended, for whom were these intended? For whom were they made? Were they, it's going to depend on, from piece to piece, I think, but I wonder if some of the, when you look at text as opposed to image, is there a distinction? Are a lot of the images actually aiming towards a broader, less enlightened audience, or not?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
So the albums the images from the albums that I was showing you, those were made in the 19th century, and they were collected by British officials, they were collected by those who were close to them, so family members, and so on and so forth. But what's interesting is that clearly they were, in a sense, they were trying to document, take a piece of India with them. And so, in a sense, it is a collaboration between European visions of South Asia, European visions of India, but also clearly it's South Asians who are making these images. It's South Asians who are making these images based on local lore, based on local custom. So so you know, in a sense, you do have the coming together of multiple visions and I suppose audience interests that belong to a number of different constituencies.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to
yeah, I mean, I thank you for the question. But I guess the way I'm going to address that and to try to answer that is perhaps thinking in the tradition that I'm most familiar with about the oral, for example, right? I mean, some in some cultures the images and artistic objects are much more preponderant, but in other cultures, of course, the oral representations of hell, whether found in Quranic verses that are recited out loud, or in sermons like fiery. What is the phrase you like? Fire and
brimstone. I think is
things. And one thing that strikes me, for example, when I was doing a field work in the Hadramaut in South Yemen, there was a session in which this preacher will deliver exactly the same sermon that he has memorized, and he has, he has repeated the same sermon every single Monday for the past 30 years, and that same sermon describing hell, right, was delivered by his father and his father before him. So this is the exact same sermon, oral depiction of hell being performed for the past 100 years, and every week people would still go there, and they would cry and they would sob and they would be in intense fear, which actually begs the question whether if we are only thinking about the substantive content or the semantic content of the sermons, then I think we will not be able to understand. But perhaps thinking about those kind of oral representations of hell as actually a kind of a discipline, right? So that we are not simply thinking, I agree with you that the question of audience, for example, is important, but we should also take into account how visual materials or oral materials are actually in themselves are technologies, right? To create a particular kind of audience. Mm-hmm. That then they do not just assume particular audience, but they are actually a mode of creating particular sensorium, a particular kind of audience. So in that sense, these objects are agentive in shaping its audience, right? As opposed to just assuming that, oh, this is written for the elites, this is written for the masses, this is constructed for the elites or the masses. We should think of many of this depiction as a way of affecting spiritual transformation, affecting sensual transformation in a way, right? As a disciplinary mode, I guess.
Hi. I was wondering if you could, I was wondering about ambiguity in the idea of hell, and kind of this idea of ambiguity in morality, so virtuous sin. And I was wondering, I know there's this verse in the Quran, al-fitna ashadu min al-qatl. I'm thinking about how does hell, or these ideas of hell across cultures, address this idea of ambiguity in the moral standing of a person, what they've committed in their lives.
Great question.
Yeah, so okay, I'm trying to understand. So the question is about how does hell helps people to envision and imagine ambiguity in their life, or?
I suppose it's more so. I think it's more so how does theology account for these ambiguities in life, and like committing a sin, but it's in service of something of a greater good. So like what happens there? What is that? How does that ambiguity get resolved in theology?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think, particularly sometimes when, theologians would have a much more, straightforward answers to this question, precisely because the theological project is really about establishing boundaries and minimizing ambiguities, right? But with, if you look at the Sufi scholars, it's precisely, they play on the ambiguities, they play on the actual, complexity of, how the Lord works, right? And the fact that God cannot be, that contradiction and paradoxes are the meaningful way of relating to God, as opposed to, the theologian mode. And so, for example, yes, hell is still a place of punishment, but in the, according to Ibn Arabi, for example, it is also a place to experience bliss, because the unbelievers, as I said, earlier during my talk, would, feel the intense pain, and then suddenly the absence of that pain, and that's where the bliss happens, right? That's when the suffering becomes bliss, because, right? The lowest level of pleasure, as Aristotle said a long time ago, is the absence of pain, right? So that's the sudden absence of pain that becomes a bliss in itself. But and also, we've seen a lot of stories. The Sufis are famous for this kind of stories of people who are supposed to go to hell for the acts that they did in their lives, and yet God decided otherwise, because God knows, for example, the intention of these people, etc. Hence, the balance and the scale and that kind of legal imaginary of hell is ultimately is being trumped by God's everlasting mercy, and that's precisely where ambiguities is very much foregrounded, right? In the fact that, yes, we need law, we need the concept of right and wrong, etc., but at the same time recognizing that human's life is much more complex, that cannot be easily adjudicated through that kind of, for example, legal means. I hope I answer your question.
I'd like to piggyback on that, because I'm thinking of the idea of ijtihad, the idea of interpretation, and in a way you have implied that there's some agency that human beings have to think through the right and wrong of various actions, and that also was brought up to me by your question. The famous, like, is it okay to steal bread for a starving child? So I'm just wondering where that notion of ijtihad or interpretation, and I don't even know that I'm using the word correctly, so forgive me if I am not using it correctly, but the idea that each person has some agency, and it's their responsibility to make those judgments, and that really is for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely, Rachel. I guess maybe ijtihad is not the right term, but certainly, ethical evaluation that happens in people's daily life, where, yes, that there are things that you are supposed to do and things that you are not supposed to do, but then, the everyday is a messy and complex experience, and so dealing with the ambiguities of the everydays and the challenges, ethical quandaries that you face in the everydays. These are something that I think many Sufi scholars and visionaries take into account in their description of hell, heaven, the hereafter, and God's ultimate mercy for these people, right? In oftentimes embarrassing the angels who are actually doing like the bureaucrats doing their job properly, and God would embarrass them and say, okay, fine, this person is supposed to go to heaven, to hell, but I'm going to take him and put him in heaven instead, right? Yeah.
Sonam.
Do you want to get in on this? Or I have a response. This is really lovely, and I don't think I don't know who asked the question, and I've got this little blinding light, and this may not be on point at all, given that it's a different theological system, if I may use that term. But at least in the Indian case, in the Indian Buddhist case, the discussion reminds me that there is a two-part point. The first thing is that there is a dimension to thinking about hell that is political. Right, there are explicit continuities drawn between systems of ethical punishment and depictions of hell, and there's a feedback that there are narratives of kings being so impressed by depictions of hellish punishment and saying, actually that's a better system than the one we got going, and creating models of imperial power to reflect retribution as a form of justice. So the first question is hell and heaven as part of an ethical system in which actions receive befitting varieties of punishment or praise or reward. But then there is, for Buddhists, at least the Buddhists I read, a second order question of what is our meta-ethical response to an ethical system set up like that, right? And the idea is almost never is the appropriate response to someone suffering in hell a sense of that they deserve it, right? The sense is actually compassion, if done correctly, like comedy about the gods in hell and the ludicrousness of an entire system in which there are bodies doing this, beating out this punishment. But then there is compassion for people who are subject to a variety of punishment for actions that they had done, but not necessarily in this life. Right? And that there is a kind of a remove from the perpetration of the act that befits this kind of anyway, so this is very complicated, and I don't know if the ambiguity is the right word, but there are ambivalences shot through in this entire thinking about punishment, suffering, growth, transformation, ethics and freedom and things like this. These are very consequential fictions, if they are fictions.
Right.
Right? I mean, yeah.
Some of this sort of judicial imagery we'll see very explicitly in some of the East Asian materials that we'll discuss in later panels, of course, where that becomes very, very direct. But I think it carries over into all of these South Asian materials as well in very interesting ways. Yama as sort of the judge, who determines.
And having to be outwitted, right? Almost like there's a very forensic kind of context
your case,
of it.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. We can't see anything from up here, so. Oh, there's.
I'd love to, but I'll ask you a question, of course, if you don't mind passing.
Thank you. Just curious about the context of these images were produced. I mean, I don't really know much about Asia in many ways. So I study like British puppetry. So there was this English tradition called Punch and Judy. It's been kind of heavily criticized being very violent. So there's one particular, there are many problems with this tradition, British tradition. One of them is hanging, public hanging, when like one punch hang the Jack Cash, who is a very famous prosecutor in England. But when it was mostly performed in England, popular in England, there was public hanging, there was like offered to public as a kind of form of entertainment. And then probably people were burned to death on the street, and then people were hanged to death on the street, and torture were kind of integrated into everyday life of people. And then it was offered as an entertainment, where it was showing to the public. And then in that context, this show is a kind of comical kind of lyric to that the culture of that time. And then like these images, I mean, just don't know what was like in 7th century India or 7th century BC, where this torture were hidden from the view of the public, where you only see the images produced. Now we only see the images produced based on what happened, through movies, and then if this Punch and Judy performed in this time, Punch and Judy performed, then it kind of looks wrong. So for the general audience, but I'm just wondering that what the context of this image were produced, where if there were the violence of people, how much people exposed to the real violence, not the violence of the image, and then how they kind of looked that together with this image, and then that's just curious. I mean,
yeah. I know it's a great question. I think there's such a range of contexts for all of these images. They're drawn from so many different areas. But I think that's a very helpful example to think with, right? The Punch and Judy shows. And I immediately think of Tibetan materials about the establishment of imperial law and judicial system with punishments and all of those things. And the difficulties in fitting that together with the conception of the Tibetan king as a bodhisattva, particularly the bodhisattva of compassion, and questions raised about how, if you are the compassionate one, how can you be punishing these criminals in these horrifying ways? And there's a textual tradition that explains that, similar to the torturers in hell being illusory manifestations with the goal of guiding beings towards awakening and away from harmful conduct, that the king operates in the same way, and that in fact the criminals who are being punished, it's claimed, are also illusory, and it's a display that he's performing like a puppet show in order to sort of educate the populace into moral behavior. And so, and this is in a context where there's little doubt that historically there were people being tortured. Whether or not they were manifestations of the bodhisattva of compassion or criminals, we can lead to determine other ways. But I think there's a similar discourse there in the role of performance, the role of art, the role of images and narratives in cultivating and creating certain behaviors and also states of mind in some way. So that's what comes to my mind. I don't know if there's other responses to.
I think you responded beautifully.
Yeah, that's right. It's a lovely. I think it's a very important topic.
Yeah.
Right. That alongside the imagination of to use the Buddhist term, right? These phantom bodies or imaginal bodies, and their pain may lie memories or continuities with the pain of real bodies and real people, right? That I think that's really important. Professor Doniger, like you mentioned, Wendy's has a maxim. She says when discussions of animals and other varieties of beings are frequently discussions of the least among us, of humans and people who do not achieve representational space in works that are lauded in culture or privileged in some other way. So I would not be surprised that there are very strong continuities and echoes and memories behind these imaginative depictions of torture.
Okay, the question of a kind of cultural memory, a historicization of the meaning of torture, and then what happens when that is no longer a common practice. And I couldn't help but think of Korea, where, as you alluded to, very much a magistrate's court is hell, and very much the tortures are tortures that people experience. They were put in kongs, they were beaten, when they were called off to justice, and that's not done any. I mean, there was torture into the 20th century, but that's not a part of something that's visual in the way that Foucault talks about these things being visual. But okay, so where do people get this sense? First of all, the ubiquitousness of these paintings. They're not locked away in museums. They're in almost every Buddhist temple. Secondly, the historical sense of the historical cruel magistrate is very alive in popular culture, most notably in the tale of Chunhyang, where she is trying to be a loyal wife, and the magistrate, the evil magistrate, wants her as his concubine, and she refuses, and she's hauled off, and she's put in a kang, and she's beaten. And people know the story. The story is continuously reinforced by filmic representations. Every great director has to take this on. And some would say misogynistically, some would say sadistically. The word sadism hasn't been mentioned yet in the context of these paintings, but it's sometimes whispered around these presentations. And that's all I'll say.
Right, thank you. Yeah. I think that's...
I have, I think, one final question, unless anyone else does. And we do. This will be our last question, if you don't mind.
Speak loud enough. That's okay. We'll pass it back to you. No. So thank you for your enlightening. We're recording. Yeah, please use your microphone. Thank you for your enlightening presentations. And I wanted to ask all the presenters and the moderators if any of you have read The Seven Moons of Mali Alameda, which was this year's Booker's winning. And it totally deals with all of these themes because it's a photojournalist in Sri Lanka who wakes up dead, as it were, and he's in, you know, sort of the bardo, and the bardo is a bureaucracy. And then it goes into, it's sort of a mystery of trying to figure out how he died, and it goes into all of the politics of the Sri Lankan Civil War. And it's apropos to everything that everybody's been speaking about. And so if you haven't read the book, I would highly recommend it.
That's lovely.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a beautiful... That's a long-standing genre, right? Like this... Yeah, right, we're talking about this. Yeah,
but you know, if I can just as a final comment, I guess more of a question to all of us, I guess, is that yes, on the one hand, I mean, we've been talking about many of these mediums as, you know, representations that are of hell, that are parasitical of the everyday, and you know, our understanding, our mundane understanding of what pain is. But then, you know, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is in what way are these mediums also also shows their own limitations. That is, that these mediums are somewhat, you know, depicting hell, but at the same time, you know, in what way, for example, you know, in the Islamic tradition, of course, there's this, you know, constant insistence on, yes, we are representing hell, but then we know that we will not be able to do so. So then the mediums actually, you know, perform its own limitation and its own inability to I guess to perform the task it set itself for us. So I'm just wondering, in like other traditions, for example, also in the Chinese tradition that Francesca talked about last night about the you know, the magistrate and the bill. I mean, in what way are these mediums actually, you know, claim it is able to represent hell, or in what way are actually also, you know, claiming their inability at the same time as they are attempting, approximating, but never able to do so.
And to what extent are they representational? Right? Like in some of these scripts for practice, like I wonder whether they're considered to be representational or mimetic or inactive, or the sense that one is actually producing.
Right, or evocative.
Right. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's great.
I can't help but think about historical makers again, you know, those people whose job it was to represent hells, whether visually, textually, whatever. And I mean, and again, in a sense, foreshadowing the panel that's to come next, bringing together multiple media. I mean, this is a way to transcend the limitation of a certain medium, right? Like, there are things that, again, I'm repeating myself, there are things that text can't do. So, you know, put a text with the image. You know, like, talk about describe hells linguistically, literarily, but then draw hells and paint hells and so on, enact hells. So, I think, I do think they were canny, our predecessors, and this was a way of kind of transcending those limitations.
The terrifying thing is, what would it look like to have succeeded? I mean, I think like the story of King Ashoka, in the legend of Ashoka, who was so taken with Buddhist preachings and depictions of hell that he actually successfully, I guess you could say, represented it by building a bureaucracy and a world in which people were tortured,
right,
with remorseless inventiveness and cruelty, right? So there is a sense in which, like, what would it look like for power to actually run away unchecked like this? Is terrifying.
Right.
Yeah.
You wake up screaming, I guess.
Yeah.
That's not funny.
Well, I'd like to thank the presenters once again, and the organizers of the exhibition and symposium, and mostly all of you for taking time out of a beautiful Saturday to see us perform our own limitations in attempting to make sense of some of these things, and look forward to all of the wonderful panels that we have ahead of us today. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. Thank you.